Would you pray with me a moment? Open my lips that my mouth might show forth your praise. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our refuge. Amen. Do you remember when the home you grew up in seemed completely normal? Like this is how everyone is? Like this is how moms and dads are? This is how kids are? This is how families are? Do you remember a time when you had a friend home from school or you went over to her house and suddenly what was normal was different? Why do you do that? I asked. Or why do you eat that for lunch? She asked. Maybe you grew up and married someone who came from a very similar family, and together you made a hybrid replica of your families of origin. Or maybe you fell in love with someone who came from a very different family, and suddenly you had to try to live a new normal. Maybe when you met them, you suddenly realized that either your family or their family were not normal. Now, my family of origin is a case in point. On the surface, everything was fine. We grew up in a place like Dover, and we were what I would call a normal family for our time and our neighborhood. But I grew up knowing not to ask questions about certain subjects. They were off limits. It was just the way things were done. Asking why was not encouraged. Like my Uncle Ralph, for example. People in my family weren't talking to Uncle Ralph. I knew Uncle Ralph was there, but they didn't talk to him. But asking any of the grown-ups why we weren't talking to Uncle Ralph was greeted with a frown, an evasion, or a redirect. The other thing about my family of origin that seemed normal at the time, but I realize now is not, is I learned later in life that normal families have fights. They disagreed, argued, even yelled at one another. But not my family of origin. Conflict was squeezed down and contained because everyone was afraid that an argument would spiral out of control. And it was only much later in life that I learned that back in my family history were all these branches that had been broken off the family tree, relationships that had been sundered. Now this was our reality, all 6 of us and the dog and all the cats. But whenever an outsider came over to the house, it was suddenly unreal. The normal was challenged. It seems funny now. When I was in seminary, I learned about family systems and counseling, and it suddenly occurred to me that somewhere back there in my family tree, there had to have been addiction and trauma. But as I said, we were not encouraged to ask those questions when I was young, and all the ones who would have known who it was are gone now. So I'll never know exactly who or what was the addiction or the trauma. Now, when I think in weeks like this week about some of the most intense energies in our country today, we're about to celebrate Memorial Day, and there's a lot of grief for a lot of people, but there's also a lot of glory. Thoughts and prayers are being offered up for victims of gun violence, and people around our country are shrugging their shoulders in acceptance of racism and violence in Buffalo. It makes me think that we as a country are like a family not coping well with trauma and addiction. We try to turn a blind eye and pretend that everything is awesome. As a country, we pause for a moment. I was at the Red Sox and we all stood up and we paused for a moment to remember the victims in Uvalde. We paused recently after the 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We paused for a moment after the top supermarket was shot up. And then we go on. We try to sweep it up, whatever it was, under the carpet, or even worse, and this is a sure sign of addiction and trauma, we scapegoat, like they're doing right now down in Texas, blaming the police for what happened down there, or blaming the mental health of the shooter. Of course he was nuts. Normal people don't do that. But we carry on as we are, rather than as a nation trying to heal. It seems to me that we are addicted to violence, and we are addicted to trauma. As a society, we are so awash in both. I've lived in other societies. I know the difference. And it's so much so that most of us don't even notice anymore. It's just like when you live in a traumatized or addicted family. Some people in the system get really angry when you point it out to them. It's just like being the son-in-law who shows up for the first family Thanksgiving and says to the table as everyone's eating, "Why is Uncle Joe lying out in the bushes in the backyard?" And everyone looks down at the plate, and Joe's daughter says, "Could you pass the potatoes, please?" And that's what we're doing as a country. I know it's funny, but I'm watching on TV. We have so many fallen soldiers from so many wars to remember on Memorial Day. So many wars in every generation. Rows and rows of flags. I've seen them in Normandy. I've seen pictures of them in Iwo Jima. I've been to Arlington and Gettysburg, and tomorrow right here in Dover. Yet it always seems to me that people try to redirect and turn it into an upbeat celebration about our heroes and America being the greatest country in the world and freedom and liberty aren't free. These guys paid the price. Woohoo, let's drink some beer. And we sweep it under the carpet, the grief felt by the families who lost someone and the sacrifice, rather than valuing the sacrifices enough to change our ways. And most importantly, from my perspective as a Christian pastor, trying to shape our national conversation so war stops being a perpetual part of our national life, so that my boys or their kids won't have to offer their lives for our country. But if you even mention this or question why we fight one war after another, or why we haven't even been asked since December 8 of 1941, or why we gave up even pretending that war was the thing of the past since the First World War, the war to end all wars, or why we don't debate our national priorities about the amount of our nation's wealth we spend on this and what we might do with that money if we didn't spend it on that, you get shouted down or shunned. And I've come to believe, as a pastor, that it's because so many of our fellow citizens are so much traumatized by generations of loss. It's impossible to imagine not carrying on as we are, because it would call into question those past sacrifices. I myself grew up in a family where every man in the family had served in the country, in the Army or the Navy. Actually, they were all mostly at sea. And I probably would have served myself. And I'm not a fool. I know that most of our wars have come to us. We didn't choose them. But in my family growing up, Memorial Day was not a keg party at the beach. It was a quiet and venerable time with stories that people, the old men, told about their friends who died in the Second World War in Korea. And as a pastor, on every Memorial Day, when they read out the names and plant the flags, I tear up when we sing our national anthem. And I sing our hymns this morning with heartfelt truth, but I'm not thinking about how awesome our country is. I'm wondering, how did George Preston's mother cope when the telegram came from the War Department? And for those of you who don't know, George Preston is the person the Legion is named after. And he died in the First World War. We are awash in violence and trauma, and we try to pretend it doesn't hurt or we can't fix it. Like all the school and church shootings in our country. This week again, children and teachers are dead, and people say it's a terrible tragedy. But it's unavoidable. The only solution is more guns or better mental health care, but not that we're going to pay for that. Arming teachers. They used to say arm the police and put them in schools, but now we blame the police because they didn't stop what happened. Certainly thoughts and prayers, freedom and liberty and states' rights and the Second Amendment. But my friends, we're the only country in the world where this happens. The solution is simple and painful. It's like asking the family, why doesn't Uncle Joe stop drinking? We are awash in violence and trauma, and we just take it for granted. Like racist violence, like shooting up the supermarket in Buffalo a couple weeks ago. The unbelievable trauma African Americans live with in our country. We forget that it's only since 1965 that Jim Crow and lynching were nominally illegal. For 100 years before that, Jim Crow and lynching were legal. And for 256 years before that, slavery was legal. The history of America is one of violence against African Americans. But many white Americans don't want the history of that history taught in our schools. And they prefer to see each incident as an incident rather than as a pattern of American life since the beginning. And we try to move on. Instead of asking the painful question, why do so many white people want to kill black people in America? And how can we stop the cycle? My friend, this is not a political sermon, but a sermon about the need for a spiritual solution to our nation's traumas and addictions. At the very least, churches like ours should act like the new son or daughter-in-law at the family holiday, who sees what's going on, what's normal, and asks why. And why not? And naming it for what it is. Painful conversations. Conversations that many of our neighbors don't want to have. Sometimes I feel like we got to call up the Canadians to take us to our AA meeting. Right? Our AA meeting about our addiction to gun violence, or our AA meeting about our addiction to racism, or our AA addiction about glorifying warfare. At the center of our faith is resurrection, which is simply this: we believe that love is stronger than death. And so as people of faith, we are called to walk into our fears, to wade into these places of death, which at least could be the conversations, and see what love can do. Amen.